Surrounding her! Get lost! Hey, what's that on the window? Back off, let's go.
The rain in Seoul did not just fall, it interrogated. It drummed against the reinforced roof of the black luxury sedan with a relentless, rhythmic aggression that would have broken a lesser man's nerves. But Kang Taehyun was not a man of nerves. He was a man of marble and iron. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the cold, metallic tang of a cleaned firearm. He sat perfectly upright, his dark tailored suit uncreased, a sharp-suited monolith of a man who moved through the city like a shadow that owned the light. To the underworld, Taehyun was the Ice King, a title earned not through cruelty, but through a terrifying, calculated absence of emotion. His power was not found in the raised voices of his lieutenants or the flash of a blade, but in the suffocating silence that preceded his decisions. He was the architect of a billion-one empire, a world where a single nod from him could shift the fate of shipping docks or silence a rival's ambition forever. His jawline was a razor's edge, clean-shaven and set in a permanent mask of practiced indifference. Behind the wheel, his large, scarred hands rested on the leather with a weight that suggested he held the very axis of the city in his grip. He looked at the world through the windshield as if it were a game of Go already won. To Taehyun, people were variables, and emotions were structural weaknesses. He had spent years purging the warmth from his blood, building a fortress around his heart, until he believed the man he used to be was buried beneath layers of silk and stone. As he glided through the neon-drenched streets, the blue-green glow of the city's signage washed over his face, illuminating the slightly furrowed brow of a man who was weary of his own crown. He was a high-status ghost haunting his own life, a businessman of death who found no joy in the luxury that surrounded him. The tuxedo-black sedan was his rolling sanctuary, a place where the world couldn't touch him, until the red light at the corner of 5th and Gwangmu forced the predator to pause. He didn't know then that the cold armor he had spent a lifetime forging was about to meet a force it wasn't built to withstand. The simple, sightless kindness of a girl standing in the downpour. For now, he was simply the king, unaware that his reign of ice was minutes away from a slow, agonizing thaw. The red light at the corner of Gwangmu was a bleeding wound in the midnight rain, casting a rhythmic, crimson pulse across the hood of Taehyun's sedan. He waited, the engine humming a low, predatory growl that mirrored his own restless silence. It was here, amidst the blurring neon and the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, that the fortress of his isolation was first breached. She stood on the rain-slicked curb, a fragile silhouette wrapped in a yellow poncho that had long since lost its battle with the storm. Emma Collins did not look like the city around her. She lacked the jagged edges and the hurried greed of the pedestrians who brushed past her. In her arms, she cradled a basket of roses, their petals bruised by the downpour, clinging to life as stubbornly as she was. Taehyun watched her through the tinted glass, his gaze cold and analytical. To him, she was a statistical anomaly, a girl who should have been broken by the weight of the city, yet stood there with a terrifyingly peaceful composure. When she stepped toward the car, her movements were not guided by sight, but by a delicate, sensory intuition. She navigated the treacherous space between the vehicles with a white cane that tapped a steady, brave rhythm against the pavement. As she reached his window, Taehyun did something he hadn't done in a decade. He lowered the glass. The scent of damp earth and dying flowers flooded the sterile, leather-scented cabin. Emma didn't recoil from the sudden, chilling presence of the man inside. Instead, she tilted her head, her sightless eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder, as if she were listening to the frequency of his soul. "A rose for a lonely heart, sir?" she asked, her voice a soft tremor that cut through the thunder. Taehyun's hand went to his breast pocket, pulling out a crisp bill that was worth more than her entire basket. "I am not lonely," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I am busy." Emma reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the door handle before finding the edge of his sleeve. She didn't take the money immediately. Instead, She lingered, her brow furrowed in a moment of deep, intuitive concentration. "You sound like the rain," she whispered, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Heavy, and full of things you can't say? There is a great sadness in your seat, sir. I can feel it cold against the air." For the first time in his life, the Ice King found no retort. The silence between them was no longer a weapon, it was a mirror. He dropped the bill into her hand and took a single, wilted rose, his fingers momentarily brushing hers. In that contact, the warmth of her skin felt like a brand against his frozen exterior. The light turned green, a sudden emerald flash in the dark, and as he pulled away, he saw her in the rearview mirror, a small, yellow speck of light receding into the gray, unaware that she had just looked directly into the sun and seen the shadow it cast. The engine of the black sedan let out a low, refined growl as Taehyun shifted into gear, the green light reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement like shattered emeralds. Inside the car, the single, wilted rose lay on the passenger seat, a splash of bruised crimson against the sterile black leather. Taehyun's eyes were already fixed on the road ahead, his mind retreating back into the cold, calculated fortress of his empire, but Emma Collins remained standing in the deluge, her head tilted as if she could still hear the fading heartbeat of the massive machine. As the car began its slow, deliberate roll forward, Emma reached out one last time. It wasn't a reach for money or a plea for him to stay. It was a blind girl's way of saying goodbye to the man who sounded like the rain. Her small, pale hand found the glass of the rear passenger window. To her, the window was a canvas of heat and vibration, warmed by the climate control of a world she would never enter. With a gentle, fluid motion, she pressed her index finger against the fogged exterior, tracing a shape that her mind saw even if her eyes could not. Taehyun didn't feel the touch, but he saw it in the side mirror. He watched the small, yellow-cloaked figure diminish in the distance, her arm outstretched as she finished her silent work. On the glass, a glowing, neon-white heart began to form, pulled from the condensation of his own breath and the humidity of the storm. It was a ghost's touch, a mark of pure, sightless gratitude left on a vehicle built for war. He didn't stop to wipe it away. He didn't even acknowledge the strange, tightening sensation in his chest that defied his years of emotional training. He simply drove, the heart vibrating against the glass as he accelerated toward the neon-lit labyrinth of the downtown district. He was unaware that this simple tracing of salt and water was now a target, a beacon of humanity that would soon contrast violently with the cold steel of the Crimson Vipers. Emma stood alone on the corner, the white cane back in her hand, having left the Ice King with the only thing his billions couldn't buy, a prayer written in water. The transition from the open boulevard to the narrow veins of the industrial district was seamless, a calculated shortcut that Taehyun had taken 1,000 times before. But tonight, the city felt different, tighter, more predatory. As the black sedan turned into a shadow-drenched alleyway flanked by rusted fire escapes and flickering neon kanji, the trap snapped shut with the mechanical finality of a predator's jaw. From the mouth of the alley, a pair of high-intensity floodlights erupted into life, blinding the Ice King's path. Taehyun slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the oil-slicked asphalt, but the exit behind him was already gone. A heavy-duty tactical van skidded into place, pinning him in a corridor of wet brick and cold steel. The luxury of the sedan's interior suddenly felt like a gilded coffin. Before the engine could even stall, 5 figures emerged from the torrential downpour like ghosts born of gunpowder and spite. These were the Crimson Vipers, moving with a disciplined, athletic lethality that marked them as more than mere street thugs. They wore dark tactical vests and hooded jackets, their faces partially obscured by the shifting shadows and the steam rising from the pavement. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. The low, metallic click of safeties being disengaged on their firearms was the only communication required. Taehyun sat perfectly still, his hands remaining on the steering wheel, his face a mask of ironclad composure even as the tactical group fanned out to surround the vehicle. The man in the front left, likely the point man, leaned forward with a tense, focused expression, his boots splashing through the heavy rain as he moved to flank the driver's side. Another man, more aggressive in his stance, held a submachine gun at the ready, his eyes locked on the silhouette behind the tinted glass. The neon signage from a nearby bar cast a sickly blue-green hue over the scene, turning the raindrops into falling shards of glass. It was a neo-noir execution chamber, silent except for the drumming rain and the heavy breathing of armed men. Tae-hyun looked into the side mirror, seeing the distorted reflections of his executioners, but his eyes were drawn elsewhere. There, vibrating against the glass as the car's engine hummed its final, defiant tune, was the glowing heart Emma had traced, a fragile, sightless prayer now caught in the crosshairs of a war. The silence of the alleyway was not empty. It was pressurized, a physical weight that pressed against the reinforced glass of the sedan. Then, the heavy tread of tactical boots splashed through a deep puddle, and the man at the center of the storm stepped into the blue-green wash of the neon lights. Victor Hale, the leader of the Crimson Vipers, moved with the jagged, hungry energy of a man who had waited a lifetime to dismantle a king. He didn't wear a mask. His face was a map of old scars and new ambitions, illuminated by the flickering glow of a nearby open sign that seemed to mock the closing of Tae-hyun's life. Victor halted inches from the driver's side door, the muzzle of his suppressed weapon leveled directly at the temple of the man behind the tinted pane. He reached out with his free hand, his rings clicking sharply against the glass, a rhythmic, taunting summons. The sound was thin and metallic, cutting through the low thrum of the idling engine like a blade through silk. "Come out, Tae-hyun." Victor's voice drifted through the glass, distorted but unmistakable in its cold triumph. "The Ice King shouldn't die in a box. Step out and look at the city you think you own one last time. Let's see if your blood is as cold as the stories say." Inside the cabin, Tae-hyun remained a statue of tailored charcoal and shadow. He didn't reach for the hidden holster beneath the steering column, nor did he look at the 4 other Vipers who had tightened their perimeter, their firearms angled in a lethal geometry of crossfire. His gaze was fixed on the condensation where the heater's warmth met the chill of the ring. There, right beside Victor's aggressive reflection, the glowing heart Emma had traced seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Victor leaned in closer, his breath fogging the exterior glass. His eyes narrowed as he tried to read the expression of the man who had always been unreadable. 10 seconds, Victor hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. 10 seconds to walk out like a man, or I turn this car into a colander. Your empire is gone, Tae-hyun. There are no more moves. No more shadows to hide in. Just you, me, and the rain. The countdown hung in the air, a silent executioner. Tae-hyun felt the vibration of the engine beneath his palms, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't calculating an escape. He was staring at that fragile, neon-white heart, wondering how a girl who saw nothing had managed to see the only part of him that was still worth killing. Inside the cabin, the silence was no longer a void. It was a pressurized chamber where the Ice King's controlled breaths met the sub-zero reality of the alleyway. Tae-hyun did not reach for his weapon, nor did he shift the car into gear for a desperate ramming maneuver. Instead, he sat motionless as the vehicle's climate control labored against the encroaching dampness, the internal blowers humming a low, mechanical dirge. As the warmth of the engine fought the freezing rain, the condensation on the driver's side window began to bloom, thickening into a heavy, opaque veil of mist. It was then that the ghost appeared. Under the harsh, blue-green glare of the overhead streetlights and the flickering neon of the open sign, the oil and salt from Emma's fingertips began to repel the moisture. Like a photograph developing in a darkroom of death, a brilliant, neon-white heart emerged from the fog, vibrating against the glass as the engine idled. The symbol was crude, trembling, and undeniably pure, a stark, glowing contrast to the matte black tactical gear and the cold steel of the rifles surrounding the car. The light from the heart didn't just sit on the glass. It bled inward, casting a soft, ethereal glow across Taehyun's sharp jawline and reflecting in his dark, calculating eyes. The man who had spent a decade turning himself into a monolith of iron felt a sudden, violent crack in his armor. He looked at the heart and saw not a drawing, but the face of the girl who had told him he sounded like the rain. He saw the only piece of evidence that his soul hadn't completely withered into ash. Outside, the Crimson Vipers hesitated. Victor Hale, his finger a fraction of an inch from ending a dynasty, felt a primitive jolt of confusion. He had expected to see Taehyun's terrified reflection or the muzzle of a return fire. Instead, he was staring at a child's symbol of love glowing between him and his target. The tactical rhythm of the ambush faltered for a heartbeat, a single, golden second where the violence of the world was held at bay by a sightless girl's parting gift. Taehyun leaned his head back against the headrest, his eyes never leaving that glowing white mark, as the first true emotion he had felt in years began to burn behind his eyelids. The world of tactical rifles and neon-slicked alleys dissolved into the gray, rhythmic blur of the Gwangmu intersection. For Taehyun, the present moment was swallowed by the memory of Emma's hand, a small, pale anchor in the sea of his cynicism. He remembered the exact sensation of her fingers brushing his sleeve, a touch so devoid of fear or calculation that it had felt like an electric shock to his system. In the cold, blue-green isolation of his sedan, that memory began to burn with a heat that no climate control could replicate. He saw her face again, tilted toward the storm, her sightless eyes seeing a version of him that he had spent years trying to bury. "You sound like the rain," she had whispered, and in the silence of the memory, those words carried the weight of a divine judgment. He had surrounded himself with silk and stone, believing that power was found in the absence of feeling. Yet this girl had reached through the layers of his armor and touched the Ice King, as if he were merely a man standing in the cold. The heart on the window wasn't just a drawing. It was a map back to a humanity he had declared dead. Taehyun realized with a staggering, quiet clarity that Emma had looked into the dark void of his life and decided it was worth a blessing. While he had been preparing to die a hollow death in a rain-soaked gutter, she had been busy tracing a reason for him to live. The realization was a violent fracture in his carefully constructed reality. In a world where every smile was bought and every loyalty was coerced, here was a gesture of pure, unasked-for grace. The Ice King looked at the glowing white lines of the heart and felt the frost within him finally begin to give way. He wasn't a monolith anymore. He was a man who had been seen by someone who couldn't see. Something pure did exist, not in the boardrooms or the back alleys, but in the simple, courageous kindness of a girl who gave flowers to ghosts. As the memory faded and the barrel of Victor's gun came back into focus, Taehyun's hand didn't move toward his weapon. It moved toward the glass, his fingers hovering just inches away from the heart, as a strange and terrifying warmth began to rise in his throat. The interior of the sedan, once a vault of untouchable power, had become a sanctuary of quiet, devastating wreckage. Kang Taehyun, the man whose pulse never quickened during back-alley executions or billion-one betrayals, felt a sudden, violent tremor in his hands. It began in his fingertips and traveled up his silk-clad arms, a physical manifestation of a fortress finally collapsing from the inside out. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned the color of bone, but he could not steady the shaking. It was not the fear of the Crimson Viper's rifles that unnerved him, nor the cold certainty of the death sentence waiting on the other side of the glass. It was the crushing weight of the grief he had spent half a lifetime outrunning. Looking at the glowing, neon-white heart, Taehyun saw the reflection of every version of himself he had murdered to become the Ice King. He saw the boy who had once believed in the sun, the young man who hadn't yet learned that silence was the only way to survive, and the ghost of the humanity Emma Collins had just pulled back from the brink of the abyss. His chest heaved, a ragged, stuttering breath escaping his lips that tasted of salt and old regrets. The realization that he had been dead long before the Vipers arrived was a blade sharper than any Victor Hale carried. He had built an empire on the ashes of his own soul, and now a blind girl's sightless gratitude had made the cost of that empire unbearable. The stoic, sharp-jawed mask he wore for the world began to fracture, his brow furrowing as the armor of his emotional detachment turned into a cage of ice that was rapidly melting. He reached out, his trembling fingers finally hovering just a hair's breadth from the glass where the heart vibrated against the ring. He wasn't reaching for a weapon or a way out. He was reaching for the only piece of light left in a city of shadows. The man who had never blinked in the face of a barrel now found his vision blurring. A hot, stinging pressure built behind his eyes, a sensation so foreign it felt like an injury. And then, as the blue-green neon of the alleyway cast a ghostly shroud over the cabin, the Ice King did the one thing the underworld thought impossible. He let go. The first tear escaped, tracing a slow, burning path down his face, a silent admission that for the first time in 20 years, he finally had something worth losing. The tactical precision of the Crimson Vipers, a machine built for cold-blooded efficiency, suddenly ground to a halt against the driver's side glass. Victor Hale's finger remained curved against the trigger, but the kill order died in his throat as he stared through the rain-streaked window. He had expected to see the frantic eyes of a trapped animal or the cold, defiant glare of a man reaching for a hidden Glock. Instead, he was met with a sight that defied every rule of the underworld. Kang Tae-hyun sat in the soft, blue-green glow of the cabin, his posture no longer a fortress of aggression, but a testament to an impossible peace. The Ice King was not looking at the rifles leveled at his skull. He was looking at the glowing, neon-white heart vibrating against the condensation, his sharp jawline softened by the first genuine tear to touch his skin in 20 years. The reflection of the heart danced in his eyes, turning the feared boss into something Victor had never seen, a human being. Behind Victor, the 4 tactical riflemen shifted their weight, their boots splashing nervously in the oily puddles. The man with the submachine gun lowered his muzzle by a fraction of an inch, his brow furrowing beneath his hood. They were trained to kill monsters and soldiers, but they were entirely unprepared for the sight of a man undergoing a spiritual transformation in the middle of a massacre. The strange, shimmering symbol on the glass acted as a visual circuit breaker, shorting out their violent intent. "What is he doing?" one of the Vipers whispered, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. Victor didn't answer. He leaned closer, his own reflection overlapping with the glowing heart, and for a fleeting second, the rival leader felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. He saw the agonizing vulnerability on Tae-hyun's face, a raw, desperate light that suggested the man inside was already in another world, one where the Vipers and their petty wars no longer held any weight. The tactical momentum was gone, shattered by the silent, sightless gratitude of a girl who wasn't even there. The predator had become a witness, and for the first time in the history of the city's gang wars, the hunters were afraid to pull the trigger. The silence in the alleyway was finally broken, not by the roar of gunfire, but by the distant, wailing sirens of the city's security forces cascading through the rain. The hesitation of the Crimson Vipers had cost them their window of absolute control. Victor Hale looked at the glowing heart on the glass one last time, a symbol that had effectively disarmed the city's most ruthless tactical unit, and spat into the rising water at his feet. With a sharp, frustrated signal, the Vipers melted back into the shadows of the industrial ruins, leaving the black sedan alone in the blue-green wash of the neon night. Kang Tae-hyun did not watch them leave. He sat in the quiet hum of his idling engine, his hands finally still on the leather steering wheel. The tear on his cheek had dried, leaving a faint, invisible trail of the man he had once been. He shifted the car into gear, not with the predatory intent of a Mafia boss returning to his throne, but with the steady, purposeful grace of a man who had finally found his North Star. The Ice King was dead, and in his place was someone who understood that the true weight of a life was measured in the things that could not be seen. The drive back to the intersection of 5th and Gwangmu felt like a journey through a different city. The neon signs no longer felt like jagged warnings, and the rain no longer felt like an interrogation. When he reached the corner, the light was still red, a pulsing crimson heart against the gray backdrop of the storm. Emma Collins was still there, her yellow poncho a defiant spark of light against the gloom, her head tilted as she listened to the rhythm of the receding tide of traffic. Taehyun stepped out of the car, ignoring the way the downpour instantly soaked his expensive tailored suit. He walked toward her, his boots splashing softly on the pavement. Emma didn't flinch. She turned her sightless eyes toward him, a small, knowing smile touching her lips as if she recognized the frequency of his footsteps. "You came back," she whispered, her voice carrying over the thunder. "The rain sounds different now. It sounds lighter." Taehyun reached out and took the entire basket of bruised, rain-soaked roses from her arms. He didn't reach for his wallet this time. Instead, he took her hand in his, large, scarred, and finally warm. "I'm buying them all," he said, his voice no longer a gravelly rasp, but a steady promise. "I'm buying the flowers, and I'm taking you home." As they walked toward the car, the glowing heart on the window began to fade into the mist, its work finished. For the first time in 20 years, the man who owned the city looked at the world and didn't see a map of conquest. He saw a garden. And as he closed the door, the Ice King finally found his peace in the dark.